The camera opens to the soft whimper of a wounded puppy as its small body trembles beside a pair of polished marble steps, sunlight glinting off the sprawling mansion where everything looks perfect, at least from the outside. But behind its golden gates and expensive smiles lies a cruelty so normalized that even innocence becomes disposable. Welcome back to Swift Tale, the home of true justice storytelling, and if you're visiting for the very first time, make sure you like, share, and subscribe, because this story will make you question what it truly means to have power and what it truly means to deserve it. Today, we dive into the world of a wealthy couple who believed their status gave them permission to humiliate, to belittle, and to harm anyone beneath them, including a poor maid who dared to love and a tiny puppy who dared simply to exist. The world saw glamour when they arrived at charity banquets, smiled for cameras, and delivered speeches about compassion and humanity. But what the world didn't see was the maid who scrubbed floors until her fingers bled, who endured their insults with silent tears, who held on to her only companion, a puppy named Luna, because kindness was the only thing keeping her heart together. And when that puppy accidentally wandered where she was allowed, when her small tail wagged innocently across expensive tiles, the couple's mask slipped entirely, and cruelty stepped forward with polished shoes and entitled rage. This story matters because far too often, the powerless are expected to endure, to serve, to bow, and to break quietly, while the powerful expect applause for the very same hands that push others down. But on that day, when the rich couple crossed the line from arrogance to abuse, when they kicked the puppy and tossed aside the maid like a broken object, fate had someone else watching, someone trained not just to fight, but to protect. What they didn't know was that next door lived a retired Navy SEAL, a man who had stared danger in the face on battlefields oceans away, a man who carried discipline, not ego, service, not cruelty, and who understood that real strength doesn't come from wealth, but from honor. His intervention wouldn't just stop their abuse, it would expose everything they had buried beneath money, marble, and influence. So settle into your seat and watch closely, because this isn't just another story about a rich family and their entitlement. This is a story about justice walking quietly until the moment it must roar. And if you believe in standing up for those who can't fight back, if you believe that compassion still has a place in a world choking on pride, then stay with us until the end, comment your thoughts, and remember, silence protects the abusive, and voices protect the innocent. With that, welcome once again to Swift Tale, where truth isn't polished, power isn't worshipped, and the helpless are never ignored. If you're new, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because today, a maid's tears, a puppy's cry, and the quiet fury of a Navy SEAL will remind us that heroes don't always wear uniforms, but when they do, even the wealthy learn to kneel before justice. The mansion itself stood like a monument carved out of ego, its towering pillars glowing under imported chandeliers that cost more than most people's homes. Nothing inside existed without intention, for every mirror was tailored to reflect wealth, every corridor polished to echo superiority, and every silent worker trained to disappear into the walls. The couple, Alexander and Veronica Sterling, were known in the city not just for their fortune, but for the performance of generosity they displayed whenever lights and cameras were pointed their way. Their names adorned charity banners and gala invitations, their curated smiles printed across glossy magazines, always labeled as the epitome of class and compassion. Yet behind those velvet curtains and diamond smiles, their world ran on intimidation, whispered threats, and a clear hierarchy in which anyone paid to work was expected not to think, not to feel, and certainly not to be treated as human. Their staff rotated so frequently that new faces appeared weekly, none lasting long enough to grow roots, and none brave enough to speak once they walked out the gold-plated gates. Luxury spilled through every chamber, glass sculptures under silk curtains, marble floors so polished that even the moonlight bowed to them, a backyard pool with turquoise water warmed and scented daily, and multiple cars parked like trophies more than necessities. In their dining hall, imported silverware rested atop crystal plates, meals designed more for presentation than hunger, while guests sipped wines older than their own families and whispered praises of the Sterling's perfection. But what no guest ever saw was the unspoken rule of the estate. The workers were shadows. They were trained to move quietly, to answer only when summoned, to keep eyes lowered at all times, and to vanish the moment a hostess lifted her eyebrow in disapproval. To them, employees were not people, but background decor, ornaments of labor arranged to uphold their illusion of divine superiority. Maria, the newest maid, had been warned by hushed voices on her first day. Don't speak unless spoken to, don't linger, don't look them in the eye, and whatever you do, keep that puppy out of sight. She cleaned rooms she would never afford to stay in, set tables she would never be invited to dine at, and breathed around people who believed breathing itself was a privilege she should be grateful for. Each evening, as the Sterlings returned from charity luncheons applauded for their kindness, the staff waited backstage, invisible, expected to help the couple step out of their public persona and back into their true selves, cold, demanding, and ravenous for authority. Every corner of their estate told a singular truth. Wealth didn't just shape their lifestyle, it shaped their identity. They didn't own luxury, luxury owned them. And while the world marveled at the Sterlings' curated benevolence, those who served behind their gilded doors learned a very different reality. That empathy evaporated the moment cameras disappeared, that glamour was built on the bruised spirits of those beneath them, and that power, when worshipped more than wielded, rots the soul quicker than any sin. Maria sensed it in the quiet way cooks avoided eye contact, in the stiff posture of the gardener who counted seconds before responding, and in the trembling hands of the laundry maid who dared not fold a single sheet imperfectly. This was not a home. It was a kingdom, and every kingdom demands subjects it can break. Before the marble floors and gold-button uniforms, before the bowed heads and trembling hands, Maria had known a very different world, one stitched together by love, sacrifice, and the quiet resilience of a family that had learned to survive with little more than faith. She grew up in a small, sun-bleached neighborhood where mornings smelled of fresh bread and laughter spilled from windows, even when wallets were empty. Her father had once been strong enough to carry the world on his back, but illness took him the way storms take roofs, quiet at first, then all at once. Her mother, worn by grief and endless medical bills, depended on Maria not just for support, but for hope. Maria's younger siblings looked at her the way children look at light in darkness, believing she could fix what life kept breaking. When she left home to work for the Sterlings, she promised she would come back with enough money to mend all the fractures, medicine for her mother, school fees for her brother, shoes for her sister, whose toes pressed through worn fabric. She entered the mansion with a heart full of gratitude, believing that work was work, dignity could be preserved, and kindness would be exchanged for effort. What she didn't expect was how quickly she would learn that in certain walls, the heart is the first thing employers attempt to strip away. Yet through all of this, Maria was never alone. Curled against her side, with fur the color of morning sands and eyes wide with unconditional devotion, was her puppy, Luna. Found abandoned behind a bakery, half-starved and shivering in rain, Luna had stumbled into Maria's hands like fate itself had delivered her. From the first moment she lifted the fragile pup against her chest, Maria felt a love that required no translation, no salary, no permission. Luna became her heartbeat, her comfort after 12-hour shifts, her warmth when the mansion felt colder than marble. Each morning before she stepped into the world of polished cruelty, she pressed her forehead against Luna's soft fur and whispered promises. "I'll keep you safe. I'll always come back." Luna was more than a pet. She was the proof that gentle souls still existed, even when life seemed determined to harden them. She waited at the door every evening, tail tapping like a tiny drum of happiness, greeting Maria as though she were royalty returning from war. Her love carried no conditions, only instinct. Maria's sadness became her sadness, Maria's joy became her joy. And in a world where Maria was ordered to be silent, Luna listened. In a world where Maria was commanded not to be seen, Luna looked at her as though she was the entire horizon. But Luna's innocence, her wagging tail and bright, trusting gaze, would soon place her in the crosshairs of a home built on hierarchy. To the Sterlings, who believed everything and everyone must remain in their assigned position, a maid was not meant to have something as pure as love, and certainly not something as defiant as joy. A puppy, in their eyes, was not a companion, it was clutter, a reminder of humanity in a house allergic to it. And as Luna's tiny paws pattered across forbidden floors, and her tender loyalty wrapped tighter around Maria, the storm brewing within those pristine walls began to sharpen its claws. Maria, unaware of the cruelty preparing to pounce, clung to the comfort Luna offered. With every soft lick to her cheek, every sleepy curl at her feet, Luna reminded her that she mattered, that she was still someone worth loving. Little did either of them know that the mansion they stepped into would not merely test their endurance, but their bond, forcing both maid and puppy into a battle neither deserved, but both were destined to face. And in that looming collision between innocence and power, Luna's small heartbeat would awaken a warrior who had seen true darkness, and refused to let it win. The cruelty did not arrive with thunder or raised voices. It came quietly, disguised beneath polite smiles and refined diction, the way winter frost settles without warning. Maria's first week in the Sterling mansion taught her quickly that she was not merely expected to work, she was expected to shrink. Veronica Sterling, always draped in silk that whispered when she moved, carried an elegance so sharp it cut. Her voice floated like perfume during public gatherings, but in private spaces it hardened, tightening around Maria's ribs like a corset. When Maria walked too loudly on the polished floors, Veronica's eyes flicked upward with the faintest curl of disdain, and she would murmur just loudly enough for staff to hear, "My God, even footsteps can sound uneducated." No direct insult, no explicit command, just a poison delivered in precise, practiced doses. Alexander Sterling's cruelty was different, slower, colder, like ice water poured carefully over skin. He seldom spoke to staff at all, not because he was busy, but because acknowledgement implied humanity. Instead, he gestured with fingers, a tilt of his chin, a snap of his cuff when he wanted Maria to move, to clean, to disappear. On mornings when Luna's soft whine echoed faintly from the servants' quarters, Alexander would pause, eyes narrowing in silent warning, as if compassion itself violated the aesthetic he demanded. Even when he said nothing, his silence vibrated with authority, communicating that Maria's world must contract further, voice tucked into her throat, gaze lowered to her shoes. At first, Maria tried to convince herself this was simply adjustment, that wealth carried a formality she was not accustomed to, but wealth was not what strung, it was the calculated stripping of dignity. Veronica began correcting her, not in duties but in existence. Stand straighter, but not too straight. Speak up, but not like that. Smile, no less, that's enough. Maria became an ornament required to perform emotional obedience. Each reminder was brushed off by Veronica as refinement, but Maria heard what lay beneath. You are lesser. Let me sculpt you into something tolerable. The staff, too, lived in quiet surrender. The cook had learned to prepare meals in silence, the butler avoided eye contact as though gazes could burn, and the gardener had stopped humming while trimming roses because Veronica once lifted an eyebrow and said, "Happiness should not be heard from service workers." Even the walls seemed conditioned to stillness. Maria began to internalize their quiet, swallowing her laughter until her body forgot how to produce it. Luna, unaware of class lines and invisible hierarchy, became the single disruption to this delicate power system. When Maria returned to her small room after hours of tiptoeing through expectations, Luna greeted her with tail-wagging delight, small paws dancing with unfiltered love. To Luna, Maria was not a servant, she was home. And yet, it was this simple joy, this untrained affection, that began to irritate Veronica. Once, when Luna licked Maria's cheek and Maria giggled softly, Veronica happened to pass the doorway. Her expression froze, not in disgust at the puppy, but in disbelief that joy dared exist under her roof without her permission. The punishments began not with words, but with rearrangements. Maria's shifts lengthened, her breaks shortened, tasks doubled. The laundry room she once shared with Luna was reassigned, forcing the puppy into a confined space near the back exit. Veronica's voice, when she delivered these changes, was coated with sugar but sharpened with glass. "You don't mind, do you? A maid should never be distracted by attachments." The pause before the last word made it clear. Love, in this house, was considered clutter. Maria refused to cry where anyone could see, but Luna felt each sorrow that trembled beneath her skin. The puppy curled against her legs at night, sensing the weight Maria carried in her chest, the way the Sterling's precision cruelty had begun to erode her sense of self. Though nothing explosive had yet happened, Maria could feel the mansion tightening around her, each day a notch closer to suffocation, each hour a silent reminder that for people like her, even breathing was something granted, not owned. She told herself to endure, to keep her head down, to survive long enough to send money home. But beneath her quiet endurance, a storm she did not know existed was beginning to stir, one that would break open the Sterling's carefully curated world and reveal everything they believed they had concealed so perfectly. And at the center of it would be Luna, the puppy who dared to love without permission, and a man who had spent a lifetime learning that the only true measure of power is how one protects the defenseless. The day of the Sterling brunch arrived with the kind of polished spectacle that only money can manufacture. Veronica had spent the entire week preparing, not the menu, not the decor, but her image. Florists arranged imported orchids along the marble staircase, chefs rehearsed plating like choreographed dancers, and servers practiced carrying trays that cost more than their monthly wages. Maria, dressed in the pressed black uniform that pinched tightly at her ribs, moved quickly through the chaos, her heart pounding in quiet rhythm. She had triple-checked the linens, polished each champagne flute, and ensured not a single floral petal dared rest out of alignment. All the while, Luna remained tucked away in her assigned corner room, whimpering softly in confusion as Maria kissed her head and whispered, "Just for today, my love. I'll be back." By noon, guests flowed through the mansion like perfume, smooth, curated, and overwhelmingly artificial. Women draped in gowns that fluttered like silk butterflies practiced laughter that wasn't real, their voices rising to complement Veronica's taste. Men with silver cufflinks and manicured confidence offered Alexander praise for his latest acquisition, a European yacht they bragged about but never sailed. The Sterlings stood at the center of it all, gleaming like saints in stained glass, absorbing admiration they believed they deserved, unaware that their smiles had become masks so habitual that even they no longer sensed the rotting beneath. Maria's job was simple, or so it was described. She floated from table to table offering champagne, refilling glasses, bowing her head just low enough to affirm she knew her place. Every gesture, every step, every breath had to be silent elegance. But in wealth's theater, perfection is a trap laid by those who demand a failure to feed their superiority. It came when Veronica tilted her glass, not in request, but in warning, as if predicting Maria would falter. And falter she did, not because she was careless, but because one of the guests, a woman wearing emeralds as large as childhood dreams, extended her heel just slightly, just perfectly, as Maria passed with a tray of rosé. The trip was silent yet catastrophic. A breath, a slip, the unforgiving gleam of marble, and the glasses shattered like brittle truth upon the floor. Rosé spilled across Veronica's couture gown in a stain the color of humiliation. Gasps fluttered through the room, not out of concern but morbid excitement, because the wealthy adore scandal the way moths adore flame. Maria stumbled backward, face flushed, words gathering like trembling birds in her throat. "I'm so sore," but she didn't finish, because Veronica's voice sliced the air cleanly. "Of course you are," 4 words, delivered not loudly but with surgical cruelty, capturing every eye in the room. Veronica stood slowly, letting the silence stretch, the way predators enjoy watching prey anticipate the bite. She dabbed at the stain with a linen napkin, her hands poised delicately as though she were handling an artifact. "Some people," she continued, gaze landing on Maria like a poisoned dart, "simply aren't built for refinement." A few guests tittered, not full laughter, but soft approval, the way courtiers once giggled when kings beheaded jesters. Alexander offered a thin, performative sigh, stepping beside his wife, shaking his head at Maria as though she had sinned, not stumbled. The emerald-wearing woman smiled faintly, satisfied with her invisible sabotage. Maria felt her heart drop, not to her stomach but to her knees. She knelt without being asked, gathering shards of glass while guests stared openly, as though watching an exhibit. Veronica did not help. She did not look away. She watched with the fascination of someone studying a creature crawl back into obedience. The tray had grown heavier in Maria's arms, not because of weight, but because of what it symbolized, her own fragility, her place beneath their gaze. As she cleared the final pieces, a small sound cut through the room, not the clink of crystal or the whisper of silk, but Luna's cry from the hallway. Somehow, unnoticed amidst the disturbance, the puppy had slipped from the back room, paws padding toward Maria with instinctual devotion. Luna nudged her, whining in worry, tiny tail wagging in a desperate attempt to offer comfort. A murmur rolled through the guests, amusement blending with disdain. A maid falling was entertainment, but a maid with a pet was scandal. Veronica did not blink, her eyes sharpened, lips curving into a smile that carried no joy. "Of course," she said coolly, "even her animal lacks training." The room laughed, soft, genteel, poison wrapped in lace. Luna shrank back, sensing the heat of a world she was never meant to enter, and Maria gathered her trembling puppy into her arms. It wasn't the ridicule that strung, but the realization that for these people, dignity was not a universal right. It was a currency reserved for the elite. Maria whispered into Luna's fur, I'm okay," but her voice cracked, exposing truth she could not hide. Because she was okay, not anymore. And though the wealthy returned to their champagne and gossip, though Veronica reset her smile and Alexander brushed off embarrassment with hollow charm, something in that moment shifted. It was small. Nearly invisible, like the first crack in marble, but it was there. And that crack would only widen. The air in the Sterling mansion did not return to calm after the brunch it curdled. Veronica's smile, still painted and regal for her lingering guests, hid a simmering fury that could scorch whatever dared stand too close. The humiliation of the spilled rosé, of Maria's presence on her knees before society's eyes, and worst of all, the puppy waddling in to comfort her, had scraped Veronica's pride raw. The moment the last guest's car disappeared beyond the iron gates, her posture changed. Shoulders straightened not with elegance but with anger, voice sharpened not with sophistication but cruelty. She turned to Maria, who stood clutching Luna in her shaking arms, trying to pretend she still belonged in her own skin. "Put that creature away," Veronica hissed, not shouted, because true cruelty requires no volume. Maria obeyed instantly, retreating to her small corner room with Luna tucked safely against her heartbeat. She whispered soft comfort, stroking the puppy's fur, trying to soothe both trembling bodies. But Luna, who only understood emotion not explanation, licked Maria's cheek, as if healing her wound with the simplicity of love. That gesture, innocent, instinctive, was what the mansion could never forgive. Maria kept Luna tucked away that evening, praying the storm would pass, unaware that predators do not rest once they have tasted embarrassment. Late afternoon, the sun had begun to melt over the manicured lawns, stretching long shadows through the west hallway. Maria returned carrying Veronica's freshly steamed gown, her breath gentle, her steps practiced to silence. Yet fate, especially when it has been forced back for too long, chooses its own moment to break. Luna, hearing Maria's footsteps beyond the door, pushed her small nose against the opening crack and slipped out. It was not boldness but longing, not disobedience but love. Her tiny paws pattered rhythmically as she followed the sound of her human, tail wagging in hopeful reunion. Maria gasped softly, gown still in her hands, just as Luna rounded the corner into the main lounge, where Veronica and Alexander sat in velvet seats, reviewing gala coverage that called them pillars of compassion. Alexander's head lifted first, gaze landing on the puppy like a blemish on his curated reality. Veronica's lips parted in a quiet, lethal smile. "Unbelievable," she murmured, rising from her chair. "Even in her absence, the help contaminates the space." Maria rushed forward, apology already tumbling in fragments from her mouth. "She didn't mean to, please, she just missed me, but compassion cannot be asked of the merciless." Veronica moved swiftly, too swiftly for someone who claimed fragility for attention. Her heels struck first, not a kick meant to nudge, but one meant to punish. The sharp toe of her designer shoe connected with Luna's ribs, sending the puppy skidding across the polished floor with a whimper that split the air open. Luna curled instinctively, shaking, small cries leaking from her as Maria screamed, a raw, animal sound she never knew she could produce. "Stop!" Maria fell to her knees, scrambling to gather the trembling pup into her arms. "She's a baby, please, please," she didn't mean, but her pleading only fanned the flame of Veronica's cruelty. Alexander stood now as well, exhaling dramatically, as though Luna's very existence offended the balance of his air. "I told you," he said coolly, adjusting his cufflinks. "The help needs to learn boundaries. If she can't control her pet, she cannot remain employed." Veronica crossed her arms, face composed despite the violence, voice dripping with satisfaction. "You and that animal both will leave, today." No empathy, no hesitation, just dismissal, as if Maria and Luna were disposable decor that had overstayed its season. Maria's hands shook violently as she held Luna against her chest, feeling the small heartbeat race beneath bruised fur. Tears blurred her vision, not just from fear, but because she had spent months swallowing mistreatment, convincing herself endurance was dignity, until this moment exposed the truth. Dignity cannot survive where innocence is beaten. She lifted her gaze, voice breaking in the echoing room. "You can't just throw us out, she's hurt, she needs a vet." But Veronica merely laughed, a sound that held no humor, only power. "Then go, you and your street mutt, take your sentimentality elsewhere. This is a home of poise, not pity." Alexander waved a dismissive hand toward the door, already bored of the theatrics of pain. Maria stood, Luna clutched gently but protectively in her arms, every memory of whispered insults and quiet punishments converging in one truth. She had never been in their home, only in their possession. She walked toward the exit, tears falling freely now, leaving pieces of herself along the hallway tiles she had spent months polishing. As she stepped out into the evening air, the mansion lights glittered behind her, grand and hollow, hiding cruelty behind imported orchids and silver champagne towers. What the Sterlings did not know, what they could not fathom, was that someone had seen. A figure across the trimmed hedge, a man built of discipline and quiet strength, had watched Maria rush out with a whimpering pup in her arms. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing not in curiosity but in recognition. He had seen this pain before, not here, but in battlefields where the powerful preyed on the weak. A retired Navy SEAL does not ignore the cry of the defenseless, and though the Sterlings believed they had ended their nuisance with a kick and a command, they had, in truth, awakened something they were unprepared to face. Maria's suffering had finally found its witness. Justice was now in motion. Maria didn't make it far past the Sterling mansion gates before her knees weakened beneath her, the world tilting with the weight of what had just happened. She sank onto the grass near the hedged walkway, cradling Luna as the puppy whimpered softly, breath short and fragile. The sun had slipped lower now, painting the estate in streaks of gold that mocked the cruelty behind its walls. Maria whispered through her tears, voice trembling like leaves in wind, "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." Luna blinked up at her with eyes that held no blame, only a trust so pure it hurt. Maria held her closer, wishing love alone could mend ribs and erase bruises. Across the yard, the neighboring house stood quieter, simpler, humbler, not built of exhibition but of intention. Its owner, Jack Reynolds, had been trimming the hedges moments earlier when he heard the scream, the kick, the whimper. Jack was not the kind of man who rushed without reason, but something in that cry, something small and helpless, pulled at instincts forged in deserts, jungles, and combat zones where he had learned to read danger not in volume, but in silence. When Maria stumbled into view, Luna bleeding lightly from her side, Jack dropped the shears without thought. The movement was quick, precise, not reactive but trained. Jack approached without looming, his voice steady, calm, reverent toward injury. "Are you hurt? Let me help." His presence didn't overwhelm, it anchored. Maria lifted her head, eyes red and blurred, unsure whether she should flee or accept. The world she had known inside the mansion taught her one truth: power demands fear. But the man before her carried his differently, not as a weapon, but as responsibility. His frame was broad, posture unshakable, yet his gaze held softness, the kind reserved for those who have seen too much to inflict harm carelessly. He knelt beside her, inspecting Luna's trembling body with the practiced care of someone who had treated wounded soldiers under moonlight. "She needs medical attention now," he murmured. "There's a vet 5 minutes away. I'll drive you." Maria nodded, unable to muster words. In moments, Jack had eased her into his truck, wrapping Luna in a soft blanket kept in the back for emergencies. He adjusted his rearview mirror not for himself, but to watch the puppy breathe. During the drive, Maria released pieces of truth she had swallowed for months. Not every detail, not every wound, but enough. Jack didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to question. He listened with the stillness of a man who knew that sometimes silence is the only bandage for a breaking voice. By the time they reached the clinic, Luna had grown quiet, head nestled against Maria's chest, her breaths uneven but persistent. The vet whisked the puppy into examination, while Maria and Jack sat in the waiting room, the sterile light overhead contrasting the storm within her. Jack spoke first. What they did was abuse, not a suggestion, not outrage disguised as... "I can't lose her," she whispered. "She's all I have." Jack's jaw tightened, not in anger toward her vulnerability, but in controlled fury at the cruelty that had forced her to say those words. "You're not losing her, and you're not going through this alone." The simplicity of that promise nearly undid her. Only after the vet confirmed Luna would recover with rest and care, minor fractures, bruised ribs, severe shock, did Jack guide Maria back outside, offering her water, not pity. The evening air felt different now, not just heavy with what she escaped, but charged with something she hadn't known in months: safety. Jack leaned against his truck, arms folded, gaze sharp yet thoughtful. "I saw enough," he said quietly. "I heard enough. They can't get away with this." Maria shook her head slowly. "People like them always do." Her voice carried the resignation of someone who had lived too long beneath power she could not fight. Jack's eyes narrowed, and for a moment his past surfaced, not in violence but in principle. He had worn a uniform not to dominate but to defend. He had stood in war zones not to enforce fear but to preserve life. In her defeat, he recognized countless civilians he had protected overseas, those who thought they were invisible until someone reminded them they were seen. "Not this time," he answered, voice low, steady, immovable. "I've faced men who believed they were invincible because of the power they held. Trust me, they all fall when truth stands tall enough." As Maria looked up at him, something shifted. Not surrender, not disbelief, hope, thin, fragile but real. Beside her stood a man who did not glorify his strength, but honored it. A man who had no interest in spotlight or applause. A man who could walk into hell not for pride, but for the ones who couldn't walk out of it themselves. The Sterlings had kicked a puppy, humiliated a maid, and believed the world would shield them because of their wealth. What they didn't know was that across the hedge lived someone who understood power differently. Someone who had spent a lifetime mastering patience, discipline, and the art of justice without spectacle. Their empire of velvet and glass had never been challenged, until now, because Jack Reynolds, retired Navy SEAL, had taken notice. And a man like him does not fight out of vengeance. He fights out of duty. The next morning, Maria awoke in Jack's guest room, disoriented at first by the softness of the bedding, the quiet hum of the ceiling fan, the absence of slammed doors or commanding voices. Luna slept beside her on a folded towel, wrapped gently in bandages, breathing deeper and steadier than the night before. For the first time in months, Maria's body wasn't pulled from sleep by dread. She sat up slowly, running her fingers through Luna's fur, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep but needed to believe in. Downstairs, the smell of brewed coffee and toasted bread drifted upward, not luxuriously prepared by paid hands, but made with intention by someone who simply cared. He descended the staircase with Luna nestled carefully in her arms. Jack was seated at the kitchen table, reading over what looked like printed forms, a pen resting across them. He stood the moment she entered, not stiffly like a soldier performing ritual, but respectfully acknowledging her presence. "Morning," he said gently. "How Luna doing?" Maria replied with a small, cautious smile. "She's stronger today. Thank you for everything." Jack waved the gratitude away lightly, but his eyes softened. He slid a plate toward her, eggs and buttered toast arranged neatly. Her instinct was to refuse, conditioned after years of being told what she deserved or didn't. But Jack wasn't giving charity, he was offering humanity. It wasn't until after breakfast, when Luna settled back into a peaceful nap, that Jack finally voiced what had been pressing on him since yesterday. "Maria, I need you to tell me everything, not just what I saw, but what I didn't." His tone was calm, but resolute. Maria's shoulders tensed, fingers twisting in her lap. She had worked in the Sterling home for 11 months. 11 months of whispered insults disguised as corrections, hours of unpaid labor, meals denied, threats cloaked in smiles, and a constant reminder that she existed not as a person, but as property. The kicking of Luna had not been cruelty born in a moment. It was a symptom of power exercised freely, repeatedly, and without consequence. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes as she spoke, her voice breaking not from weakness, but from the exhaustion of silence finally escaping. "Mrs. Sterling said I should be grateful, that girls from my neighborhood don't get jobs like this unless someone takes pity." Jack's jaw tightened. "Pity is not ownership." Maria nodded quickly, as if afraid to disagree with someone who finally defended her. She continued, the verbal abuse, the accusation that she had stolen missing jewelry later found in the Sterling child's playroom, the weekend she wasn't allowed to leave, because a gala required round-the-clock preparation. And finally, the puppy, Luna, rescued from a shelter by Maria on her one rare day off, a creature who brought her warmth in a mansion where she was treated colder than stone. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Yesterday wasn't the first time, she whispered, staring at her hands. He threatened to get rid of her before. He said pets were for people who could afford affection. The words shook, not because she feared Jack's reaction, but because speaking them aloud forced her to confront how deeply she'd normalized cruelty. Jack leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes steady. Maria, people like the Sterlings rely on silence. They build palaces out of intimidation, but they don't get to hurt you or her and walk away clean. She blinked, absorbing his resolve like sunlight after too many months in shadow. But no one believes people like me, she murmured. They have lawyers, connections, money, Jack interrupted softly but firmly, and I have training, discipline, and a record that makes people listen when I speak. He gestured to the forms on the table, documents, statements, contact information for an attorney specializing in worker abuse and animal cruelty. He had already made calls that morning, not for spectacle, not for glory, but for justice. Maria's breath caught, not in fear but in unfamiliar hope. Luna stirred at her feet, stretching weakly before nestling closer. Jack continued, his voice carrying the tempered steel of someone who'd fought battles most couldn't imagine. I've seen war, Maria. I've seen men with power crumble because someone finally stood beside the ones they thought were disposable. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. You're not disposable. Luna isn't disposable. And I don't strike unless there's a cause worth fighting for. This is one. In that kitchen. Surrounded by quiet morning light and the gentle breathing of a recovering pup, Maria realized that the world outside the Sterling mansion was not only wider but capable of justice. For the first time since she took the job that stole her dignity, she wasn't alone. Someone had heard her, believed her, chosen her side. Jack didn't promise revenge. He didn't vow destruction. He promised protection, truth, and consequence, without the arrogance wealth often carries. And as Maria looked into his steady gaze, she understood that the Sterlings had awakened something far greater than a disgruntled maid. They had awakened a protector whose life had been built on defending the vulnerable. And this time, the battle wasn't fought on foreign soil. It was fought on manicured lawns, behind gated driveways, in a world where cruelty hid behind chandeliers and designer suits, until a Navy SEAL decided it would hide no longer. By late afternoon, the Sterling mansion buzzed not with elegance, but with agitation. Mrs. Sterling paced across the marble foyer, her heels hitting the floor in impatient staccato, while Mr. Sterling stood near the bar, swirling amber liquor he'd poured too early in the day. The absence of Maria's silent presence, no polished counters, no freshly ironed suits, no obedient nods, offended them more than her departure itself. What unsettled them deeper, however, was the sudden knowledge that someone had seen them lose control. Someone had witnessed their cruelty not toward a servant they considered that their right, but toward the puppy, the one creature society would never permit them to justify harming. Mrs. Sterling snapped. She didn't just walk out. She was picked up. Someone took her. Her husband responded with a dismissive wave, but the twitch in his jaw betrayed unease. Whoever it was will regret interfering. People like her don't get saviors, they get replaced. They had built their world on certainty. Wealth buys silence, status erases consequence, and people of Maria's station absorb injustice as quietly as wallpaper. But this time, Mrs. Sterling was not satisfied with quiet replacement. She dialed a number, her lawyer, a man known not for fairness, but for bending rules so far they often snapped after the courtroom lights dimmed. Within hours, threats had been drafted, email notices prepared, and a legal accusation thrown into the digital air. Maria stole from the Sterling home. It wasn't original, it was habit. Theft accusations were their comfortable weapon, an eraser used so often it felt routine. Jewelry, designer scarves, the watch Mr. Sterling misplaced himself. Each time, Maria had accepted blame silently, trembling, fearful of losing the only income keeping her afloat. Now, however, silence was no longer hers to give. When the notice arrived at Jack's property, slipped into his mailbox by a courier who never met his eyes, Jack read it without surprise. His expression didn't change, his heartbeat didn't rush. He simply set the paper down on the kitchen table where Maria sat with Luna curled at her feet. As her gaze scanned the accusations, theft, breach of confidentiality, unauthorized departure, her hands shook, old scars of fear resurfacing. Mrs. Sterling's voice echoed in her head. "Without us, you are nothing." Jack leaned forward, calm but unyielding. "This is their pattern. When control fails, they manufacture guilt." Maria swallowed hard, ashamed at how quickly panic returned. "What if they win? What if—" Jack cut in gently. "Maria, I've faced enemy governments with better intelligence than the Sterlings. They aren't strategists, they're entitled bullies with stationery." The line startled a laugh from her, a small but genuine break in the tension. What the Sterlings didn't realize was that Jack had already anticipated retaliation. True power doesn't react emotionally, it prepares quietly. That morning, he'd contacted not only an attorney, but an advocacy organization specializing in domestic worker rights, and more dangerously for the Sterlings, a former military colleague now working in federal animal cruelty investigations. The Sterlings thought they were facing a Maid. They were, in truth, up against a network stronger than any gala guest list. At the mansion, rage replaced concern when their threats went unanswered. Mrs. Sterling demanded escalation, press harassment charges, and call the shelter. The dog wasn't licensed. If she kept it illegally, that's leverage. Her husband nodded, eager now to restore power the way he restored investments, by crushing opposition. But what neither expected was the rumor trickling through the town, neighbors whispering, staff exchanging glances, the vet who treated Luna discreetly sharing what he'd seen. Money could buy silence, but compassion travels without cost. The first real crack in their dominance came not from paperwork but from their staff. The driver, who had witnessed Mr. Sterling's violent kick, resigned quietly, citing ethical conflict. The housekeeper called in sick and never returned. The chef asked to review safety clauses in his contract. The Sterlings didn't understand. They had never considered that loyalty required respect. In their world, the help was replaceable, expendable, faceless. Maria, meanwhile, sat in Jack's living room, watching Luna doze peacefully while Jack made steady calls, documenting every threat and accusation. He didn't rant, didn't curse, didn't rush. He moved with precision and patience, the way only someone trained to dismantle power structures without leaving legal fingerprints could. "They will escalate," he told her quietly, "and that's good. It exposes them." By nightfall, the Sterlings issued a public statement through their attorney. "We were generous to her, she betrayed us." Pity wrapped in poison, victimhood disguised as refinement. Yet the world outside their mansion no longer applauded their veneer. The internet murmured, questions surfaced, and the image-perfect couple felt the first chill of slipping control. The Sterlings believed their mistake was hiring Maria. Their mistake was assuming no one would ever stand for her. And as they sharpened their claws, eager to reclaim dominance, they didn't realize they had already stepped into a battlefield they couldn't navigate. Because their opponent wasn't a maid, nor a puppy. It was a man trained not merely to fight, but to protect. And the Sterlings had just declared war on someone who never begins one, but always finishes it. The morning after the Sterlings' threats, the world outside their mansion began to stir with a quiet reckoning they could neither command nor control. Jack had already drafted statements, contacted an attorney specializing in worker rights, and reached out to the local animal protection authorities. Maria, sitting beside him in the small kitchen of his home, watched the plan unfold, a sense of relief mixing with lingering fear. Luna rested in a soft blanket at her feet. Her small ribs healing, her trust slowly returning, a symbol of resilience Maria clung to as Jack explained the steps ahead. The Sterlings had underestimated the ripple of consequences, how evidence, witnesses, and truth could collide to dismantle arrogance far stronger than marble columns or designer shoes. By midday, the first letters arrived, formal complaints filed with labor boards citing unpaid work, verbal abuse, and unlawful termination. Animal Control had received the report detailing the puppy's injuries, and the vet's testimony, documented with photographs and medical records, provided undeniable proof. Jack and Maria compiled witness statements from previous staff who had fled quietly, too fearful to challenge the Sterlings while under their roof. Each story layered over the other, a growing dossier of systemic abuse that the couple could no longer ignore. It was precision in action, a strategic dismantling of power that relied not on vengeance, but on facts and accountability. The social ramifications were swift and unmistakable. News outlets, always hungry for scandal among the wealthy, picked up the story, though Jack had guided Maria's interviews carefully, ensuring she remained dignified, clear, and unwavering. Headlines spread across print and digital platforms: maid and puppy abuse exposed at elite estate, neighbors witness cruelty by wealthy couple, Navy SEAL intervenes in domestic abuse case. The Sterling's carefully constructed image, polished over years of charity events, gala appearances, and public accolades, began to crack under scrutiny. Sponsors, business partners, and high-profile associates distanced themselves, afraid their names might become tainted by association. Even within the local community, whispers turned to conversations, and conversations to collective action. Former neighbors who had turned a blind eye now questioned their silence. Local advocacy groups offered support for Maria and Luna, ensuring her story had a platform and that she was no longer alone. The Sterlings, for the first time, experienced the vulnerability that so many of their past victims had endured. No gold could protect them from public opinion, no wealth could erase the evidence, and no charm could undo the witnesses who finally found courage. Back at Jack's home, Maria watched Luna play quietly, her tail wagging in measured delight, and felt the first real sense of empowerment since her ordeal began. Jack, standing at the window, observed the mansion across the street and spoke softly but firmly. "This is only the beginning. They'll try to intimidate, to threaten, to spin lies, but truth is persistent. Lies crumble when exposed to enough light." Maria nodded, her hands steady now where they had once trembled uncontrollably. The evidence was clear, the community watchful, and the law was on her side. The Sterling's empire of fear was unraveling not with noise or violence, but with the measured application of justice. By nightfall, the Sterlings had begun to feel the pressure mount. Calls went unanswered, legal advisors pressed with reminders of growing scrutiny, and public sentiment shifted from curiosity to outrage. The mansion, once a symbol of untouchable authority, now felt oppressive, as though the walls themselves conspired to reflect the shame they could not wash away. The couple's private indulgences no longer shielded them. Luxury became a gilded cage. Every step they took, every plan to retaliate, was now countered with legal preparation, strategic oversight, and moral authority, an entirely new battlefield they were unprepared to fight. In the quiet of his office, Jack reviewed the growing dossier one last time before advising Maria to rest. He understood the power of momentum. The Sterlings had overstepped, and the consequences were now unavoidable. Justice, methodical and unrelenting, was moving in their direction. And while the Sterlings counted on fear to maintain control, they were about to learn that courage, combined with truth, is an even stronger force. For Maria, for Luna, and for all those who had been silenced, the tide had shifted. The Sterlings' reign of entitlement was crumbling, and there would be no sanctuary behind their marble gates. As the legal machinery moved and the public began to take notice, the contrast between the Sterlings and those fighting for justice became painfully clear. Maria, once bent under the weight of humiliation and fear, was beginning to stand taller, not just physically, but emotionally. Each phone call from Jack, each conversation with attorneys and witnesses, reminded her that dignity was not something granted by those in power. It was something one reclaimed through courage and truth. She held Luna close, stroking her fur as the puppy, now stronger and less fearful, nudged her hand for reassurance. In those small, quiet moments, Maria felt the first real warmth of freedom, the knowledge that love and empathy could survive even in a house built on cruelty. Meanwhile, across the manicured lawns and polished hallways of the Sterling mansion, the couple's cruelty festered unchecked only by circumstance, not conscience. Alexander and Veronica moved through their estate with the arrogance of those accustomed to obedience, but now that obedience had turned to whispers of dissent. Their staff, once silent and terrified, had begun sharing stories, small acts of defiance adding to the growing record of abuse. The Sterlings, used to inhumanity being invisible, were learning for the first time that humanity, when united and persistent, could pierce even the thickest veil of entitlement. Jack observed it all with a clarity born of experience. He had faced opponents who relied on fear, deception, and overwhelming power, and he recognized the Sterling's methods immediately: intimidation, gaslighting, and the illusion of invulnerability. But he also understood that true strength is measured not in domination, but in protection. Sitting beside Maria, watching her regain her voice, he offered guidance, reassurance, and strategy. They are cruel because they are weak. They cannot measure their worth against anyone else, so they destroy, he said softly. Maria listened, absorbing the logic and the truth, feeling a spark of confidence that had long been extinguished under the Sterling's oppressive rule. In the following days, the Sterling's desperation became palpable. Attempts to intimidate Maria failed, threats faltered, and their own staff began to question loyalty to employers who valued appearance over ethics. Their once impenetrable social image cracked under scrutiny, invitations to high-profile events were rescinded, and murmurs of scandal spread through their social circles like wildfire. Meanwhile, Maria's story, supported by Jack's discipline and strategic planning, became a beacon for others who had suffered in silence. Her courage, paired with the steady presence of someone trained to fight injustice, demonstrated the power of empathy and moral conviction in a world that often rewards cruelty. The emotional contrast could not have been starker. Maria's resilience, grounded in love for Luna and a newfound understanding of her own worth, was met by the Sterling's deteriorating arrogance, their inhumanity exposed to the light. Luna, once trembling at the sound of a raised voice, now played openly, a living testament to the possibility of healing and protection. The house that had once suffocated Maria and her puppy with cold marble and sharper words now felt like a prison of the Sterling's own making, walls closing in not because of structure, but because their cruelty had no support outside its shadow. Through it all, the message was clear. Humanity, when exercised with courage and steadfastness, can confront and overcome inhumanity. The Sterling's wealth and status could not shield them from accountability, and Maria's endurance, bolstered by Jack's intervention, symbolized the triumph of empathy, moral fortitude, and the quiet, unyielding power of protection. It was a turning point, not just for Maria and Luna, but for anyone who had been silenced by fear or crushed under the weight of entitlement. In this battle, strength was measured not by dominion, but by the willingness to defend the defenseless, and in that measure, the Sterlings had already lost. The morning of the court hearing arrived like a storm over the horizon, tense and inevitable. Maria, dressed simply yet confidently, carried Luna in a small carrier, the puppy's soft whimpers replaced by calm reassurance from the presence of Jack Reynolds beside her. The sterile halls of the courthouse were buzzing with quiet murmurs. Journalists, neighbors, and advocates filled the seats, drawn by the story that had captured attention across the city. The Sterlings, in contrast, arrived with a polished mask of composure, designer attire concealing the tension in their posture, their eyes darting nervously as they scanned the courtroom. This was their stage, their arena, but for the first time, they were not in control. As the proceedings began, the evidence was laid out meticulously. Medical reports documented Luna's injuries, photographs corroborated the timeline of abuse, and testimony from former staff revealed patterns of cruelty that spanned months, not days. Each piece of evidence, each statement, chipped away at the carefully constructed narrative of wealth and benevolence the Sterlings had cultivated. Maria's voice, initially shaky, gained strength as she recounted the harassment, humiliation, and physical abuse she endured. She spoke not from anger alone, but from clarity, backed by the weight of truth and the strategic support of Jack and their legal team. The Sterling's attorney attempted to deflect, painting Maria as ungrateful, exaggerating incidents, and attempting to cast doubt on her credibility. But Jack's presence and preparation ensured that these attempts failed. He had documented the abuse meticulously, anticipated every manipulation, and built a framework in which truth could not be denied. Witnesses were ready, and the community's support added pressure that the Sterlings could neither ignore nor manipulate. Their usual tools of intimidation faltered under the methodical and undeniable presentation of evidence. As the judge listened, nodding occasionally, the gravity of the Sterlings' actions became clear. The courtroom, once a place of sterile formality, now hummed with the energy of accountability. Maria's courage was mirrored in Luna's presence, innocent yet resilient, a tangible reminder of the harm caused and the life preserved through intervention. Each statement reinforced the same message. Wealth does not equate to immunity, status cannot erase cruelty, and those who exploit power for harm will face consequences when the law is wielded wisely. By the afternoon, the proceedings reached a pivotal moment. The Sterling's social influence and threats of retaliation were systematically dismantled. The legal team, guided by Jack's strategy, ensured that the focus remained on abuse, not entitlement. Every attempt to obfuscate or intimidate was countered by documentation, testimony, and the undeniable proof of Luna's injuries. The couple's arrogance, once shielded by wealth, now exposed them to the scrutiny of justice and public opinion simultaneously. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, the room held its collective breath. The Sterlings were found liable for both worker abuse and animal cruelty. Fines, restitution, and mandated community service were ordered, accompanied by a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It was a moment of vindication not only for Maria and Luna, but for all who had witnessed the courage it took to confront entrenched power. The Sterlings, for all their money and influence, could not erase the accountability that had finally caught up to them. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, and voices recounted the story to the city beyond the courtroom walls. Maria, holding Luna close, felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a combination of relief, triumph, and the quiet satisfaction that justice, long delayed, had arrived. Jack stood beside her, calm but visibly pleased, understanding that their careful, measured actions had not only protected the innocent, but also sent a message that cruelty, no matter how well hidden behind wealth and status, would ultimately face consequence. The Sterlings' empire of arrogance had crumbled in the court of law, and a small act of courage, combined with a lifetime of discipline, had made the difference. The weeks following the court verdict brought a kind of calm Maria had never known. The mansion that had once loomed over her like a fortress of cruelty now existed only in memory, a stark reminder of survival and the strength she had discovered within herself. Maria, with Luna safely at her side, moved into a small but welcoming apartment, her first home that she could truly call her own. Every morning, sunlight streamed through the windows without judgment, and the air was filled not with orders or disdain, but with freedom. Luna, once timid and fearful, now bounded through the rooms with unrestrained joy, her healed ribs a testament to resilience, and her presence a constant source of comfort and courage. The bond between them had deepened, forged in the fires of hardship, and strengthened by the knowledge that love and loyalty could endure even the harshest cruelty. Jack Reynolds remained a steadfast presence, though never imposing. He offered guidance, safety, and perspective, but allowed Maria to reclaim control over her life. With his support, she began exploring work that recognized her abilities rather than exploiting them, speaking publicly about her experience in a way that empowered others facing abuse. Her story, amplified by media coverage and social support, inspired conversations about workplace fairness, animal protection, and the consequences of unchecked entitlement. For the first time, Maria's voice had weight beyond her immediate struggle, and she discovered that speaking truth could be as transformative as surviving it. Meanwhile, the Sterlings faced a very different reality. Their once-envied social circles turned cold, invitations disappeared, and partners distanced themselves as news of the legal verdict circulated. The fines and mandated community service were only a small part of their punishment. The real blow came in the form of public disgrace. Where once they were admired for wealth and refinement, they were now remembered for arrogance, cruelty, and moral failure. The social veneer they had cultivated so meticulously could not withstand the scrutiny of truth, and their influence waned, leaving behind hollow halls and tarnished reputation. For the first time, they felt the vulnerability and humiliation that had marked Maria's daily existence for months, and the world watched quietly as entitlement met consequence. For Maria, the aftermath was not about vengeance, but healing. She spent mornings walking Luna through the park, evenings reconnecting with family, and moments in between reflecting on her journey from fear to empowerment. Each small victory, a new job, a successful public talk, a day without anxiety, was a reminder of the strength she had cultivated. Jack's mentorship and protection, coupled with her own courage, had created a foundation that could withstand future challenges. Maria had learned that dignity is never given. It is claimed, defended, and nurtured, often in the most unexpected ways. Luna, once her joyful leaps and gentle nudges reminded Maria daily of what they had overcome together, and how love, even when small and defenseless, could catalyze monumental change. Together, they had transformed fear into resilience, cruelty into clarity, and injustice into opportunity. Maria understood now that survival was only the first step. Thriving required courage, community, and the unwavering refusal to be silenced. And though the Sterlings' wealth remained, their moral bankruptcy could not be purchased back. Maria and Luna's story stood in stark contrast, one of endurance, compassion, and the undeniable truth that humanity, when nurtured and protected, can prevail over entitlement, cruelty, and abuse. The chapter of suffering had ended, replaced by one of empowerment, protection, and hope for a future where justice is not a privilege, but a principle. As the dust of the legal battle settled and the echoes of public scrutiny faded, Maria took time to reflect on everything she had endured and everything she had gained. She realized that courage is not the absence of fear, but the act of moving forward despite it. The months spent under the Sterlings' oppressive rule had tested her in ways she never imagined, teaching her the fragility of silence, the dangers of unchecked power, and the extraordinary strength found in perseverance. Each humiliation, each threat, each moment of despair had, paradoxically, prepared her for the reclamation of her dignity. Luna, ever faithful, had not only survived but thrived, serving as a living reminder that innocence and loyalty, when protected, have the power to change lives and awaken allies where none were expected. Jack Reynolds' presence had been instrumental, but Maria realized the most important lessons came from within. The value of self-worth, the importance of speaking truth, and the necessity of standing firm against injustice were lessons she would carry forever. She learned that justice does not always arrive immediately, nor is it always easy to achieve, but with persistence, strategy, and moral clarity, even the seemingly untouchable can be held accountable. Her experience had shown that cruelty, no matter how cloaked in wealth or status, is never absolute, and that protection and intervention, whether from unexpected allies or determined advocates, can restore balance to even the most lopsided situations. For the Sterlings, the lessons were harsher, though perhaps necessary. Their attempts to dominate, humiliate, and manipulate had led not to submission, but to exposure and consequence. Wealth and social status, once their shields, became irrelevant in the face of truth. The stark contrast between Maria's restored life and their ongoing disgrace highlighted the moral principle that entitlement is never an excuse for cruelty, and that power wielded without empathy inevitably collapses under scrutiny. Their downfall underscored a universal truth. When humanity is abandoned in favor of dominance, consequences are inevitable. Maria's story also became a beacon for others. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers were inspired to speak out, report abuses, and defend those without a voice. Her courage, amplified by Jack's guidance and the justice system, demonstrated that individuals can effect change even against entrenched power. The narrative of triumph over adversity, love over cruelty, and justice over intimidation resonated far beyond her own life, reminding everyone that moral integrity is stronger than wealth, that protection of the vulnerable is a responsibility not to be ignored, and that every act of courage creates ripples that reach beyond the immediate moment. In the end, Maria came to understand that the ordeal had transformed her in ways she could not have foreseen. She had emerged not only with her dignity restored, but with an unshakable belief in her own strength, the enduring loyalty of Luna, and the knowledge that justice, though sometimes delayed, is inevitable when guided by truth and courage. And as she looked toward the future, she carried with her the certainty that no act of cruelty, no display of entitlement, and no attempt to silence the righteous could ever erase the lessons learned, the strength gained, and the hope rekindled in hearts willing to stand for what is right. And so, the story of Maria and Luna comes to a powerful close, but its lessons linger far beyond the mansion gates. From silent suffering under the Sterlings, cruelty, to the triumph of justice, aided by courage and protection, this journey reminds us all that dignity cannot be stolen if we are willing to claim it, and that even the smallest acts of love and loyalty, like Luna's unwavering companionship, can spark change in ways we never imagine. Maria's resilience, bolstered by Jack Reynolds' intervention, demonstrates that standing up against injustice is not only possible but essential, no matter how insurmountable the odds may seem. Her story proves that truth, courage, and compassion are forces far stronger than wealth, entitlement, or intimidation. Here at Swifttail, we share stories like this not just to inform, but to inspire, showing that the world, even when harsh and unfair, contains heroes, allies, and those willing to stand for what is right. If this story moved you, reminded you of the importance of speaking up, or gave you hope that justice can prevail, I encourage you to take action in your own life. Stand for the vulnerable, challenge cruelty, and support those who cannot yet defend themselves. And of course, if you're visiting Swifttail for the first time, don't forget to like this video. Share it with friends who need to hear this story, subscribe for more stories of courage and justice, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your voice matters just as much as Maria's did. Stories like Maria and Luna's remind us that the world changes when we act with courage and integrity. Each like, share, and comment amplifies these stories, helping others learn, grow, and be inspired to stand for what is right. So take a moment, show your support, and remember, justice may be delayed, but it is never denied when truth and courage come together. Thank you for watching, thank you for believing in the power of action, and welcome to Swift